Hey everyone, and introduce some terms that, as if you decide to continue on your sourdough journey, that you're going to be exposed to. So with that, let's do a recap of sourdough math and terms. So starter. What is a starter? So a starter is the wild yeast that you are growing that will allow your bread to rise. It also will break down the gluten in the flours that you are using. The benefits of sourdough is because it's a very slow fermentation process. Wild yeast takes a lot longer to ferment than commercial yeast. It breaks down the gluten better, and that's why it's gut friendly. And some folks that have gluten intolerance can actually eat sourdough bread. So your starter is what you build and maintain your yeast colony. It has good bacteria. It builds different lactic acid, and so a healthy starter will have a good balance of everything. And as you saw in our video, it can take as long as a month to grow a starter if the conditions in your kitchen are colder, or wherever you decide to grow it. It could go as quickly as 5 days, depending on how warm your kitchen is. Now, when it came to your starter, there was two terms that we had used when it came to starter. So there's your active starter. When it's at peak, it's bubbly, everything is balanced well. It is at its best point to release carbon dioxide and really help your bread rise. The other one, when it comes to your starter, is discard. Discard is also a process, but when you discard, because you want to maintain a good balance in your starter, so you want to take out a portion of your starter every day when you do your feeding, and we'll get into what a feeding is in a second. So when you discard, you can save that discard in a jar in your fridge, and there are plenty of recipes out there that use sourdough discard. It's basically not active, unfed wild yeast. So I have found that it really enhances chocolate in chocolate chip cookies. I've made pancakes with it. I sometimes want using one and do crackers. So that's the other aspect of it. Now, in order to maintain your starter, you have to do regular feedings. Now, basically, your starter is essentially flour and water. That is it. Now, you might watch videos that some people put pineapple juice, honey. You don't need to do that. A starter is just flour and water. But in order to maintain your starter, you need to give it regular feedings. Now, if you are a regular baker or you want a routine, the recommended feeding schedule for a starter is every 24 hours. There are some, especially if you're a super active baker, that do it every 12 hours, but at minimum, you do need to feed your starter every 24 hours. And feeding is just giving your starter fresh water and fresh flour. But you have to take out some of what's in the jar when you do that, because if you just keep feeding it, it's gonna get, so imagine you have 100 grams of starter in your jar and you feed it 50 grams because that's what you've been feeding. Because you didn't take out, you're starving your starter because it's not having a 1-to-1 ratio in terms of feeding. It's actually getting half the recommended food. So that's why you discard, to keep a good healthy balance in it. And you do regular feedings with fresh flour and water. Now, if you do it in, if you decide to keep your starter in the fridge, you feed it at minimum once a week. There's some people who do really heavy feeding, so they give it a huge amount of flour, a huge amount of water, and then they feed it. I've seen videos where people haven't fed it for 3 months. I definitely don't recommend that you do that because a hungry starter will produce a liquid that we talked about called hooch, which is an alcohol byproduct from it. And a lot of folks think that your starter has gone bad. You really can't kill your starter, um, but you can starve it. So I will say that at some point it will go bad. You will likely have mold grow. But if you have it in the fridge and you forget to feed it for 1 week, it's not going to kill your starter. Very little can kill your starter. Mold pretty much is what kills your starter. What also can kill your starter is if you feed it before peak. So when you feed your starter and you give it flour and water, when it eats it, it's gonna release carbon dioxide. Now, if you remove from your starter before it reaches peak, you're actually taking out probably more of the good bacteria than the bad in there, and you're actually weakening your starter. So that's something to keep in mind, that you will learn the balance of when it's time to feed your starter. But for the most part, um, it's really hard to kill a starter. If you go above, I believe, 110 degrees, you can kill your starter because that's too hot. That's going to completely inactivate the yeast in there. When you put your starter in the fridge, it slows it down, but the activity is very low. You don't want to freeze your starter, but you'll learn as you go on what the healthy balance is. Another term that we had mentioned was hydration, and hydration is the amount of water compared to something. So when you're talking about the hydration of your starter, you are looking at the amount of water to flour. So for the most part, you're always feeding your starter the same amount of water and the same amount of flour. Some, depending on your environment, some people feed actually a little more flour than water, and we'll get into the math about that in a few minutes. But for the most part, most recipes will call for a 100% hydration starter, which means whatever feeding ratio that you've used, you have used equal amount water to flour. In a recipe, the hydration level is the amount of water to flour, and we're going to go into that in a few minutes as well. The next term I want to bring up is inoculation. And I didn't spell check all of these, so it is what it is. I'm in a safe space. Inoculation. What the inoculation refers to, and this is in a recipe, is the amount of starter that's in the recipe compared to flour. And we'll go into that. And then another term that you'll be exposed to is a levain. And a levain is basically an offshoot of your starter. You don't have to make a levain. You can mess with the amount of starter in your jar. I personally don't like to do that. I like to keep my starter at a good balance. I know a lot of professional bakers also do it where they don't mess with their starter, but if they want to bake with the yeast, they'll take some discard from the starter and build a levain. And this levain will be your leavening agent. It's called your ferment, and it's what's going to give and a levain is active starter. So it's at its peak, it's at the best carbon dioxide release phase, and that's what you could feed with. Now, we also talked about feeding ratios, and what feeding ratios are is the amount of starter to the amount of water to the amount of flour that you have. So it's 3 numbers, and feeding ratio is the starter as compared to water as compared to flour. So the most basic feeding ratio is a 1:1:1 feeding ratio. So that means the amount of starter is equal to the amount of water. the amount of starter is equal to the amount of flour. And then if you eliminate the starter for a minute, the amount of water is equal to the amount of flour. So for example, in your starter, and I think I gave an example in a little bit, but just we'll do it here. If you have 10 grams of starter in your jar, 10 grams of water to that 10 grams of starter, 10 grams of flour to that 10 grams of starter, a 1-to-1-to-1 feeding ratio. Now, if you're like me, you're gonna watch tons of videos. I promise it seems really overwhelming at the beginning. I promise it will click. It is overwhelming at the beginning. Lots of math, lots of terms. But what you'll see is some of the common feeding ratios are listed here. It's 1-to-1-to-1. So equal parts starter to equal parts water to equal parts flour, 1-to-2-to-2, 1-to-3-to-3, 1-to-4-to-4, 1-to-5-to-5, which is my maintenance feeding ratio. And then I actually use a 1-to-10-to-10 feeding ratio when I make my levain. I give it a really strong feed. Now, just to give you an example of the feeding ratio to help you understand the math, again, we did the 1-to-1-to-1. So 10 grams starter to 10 grams water to 10 grams flour. To get to the feeding ratio, it's 1. So 10 times 1 is 10, 10 times 1 is 10. A 1-to-1-to-1 feeding ratio, 10 grams of starter to 10 grams of water to 10 grams of flour. Now, a 1-to-5-to-5 feeding ratio is 10 grams of water. You multiply by 5, 10 grams of starter, I'm sorry. You multiply by 5, 10 grams of water. So that makes a 1-to-5. And likewise with the flour, because for feeding ratios, you're comparing it to the first number, the amount of starter you have. 10 times 5 is 50. Hence the 1-to-5-to-5 feeding ratios. Now, the reasons that there are different feeding ratios is because the higher the feeding ratio, the longer it will take for your starter to feed through the flour. It also allows you to maintain a small amount of starter in the jar. So for example, if you did a 1-to-1-to-1 feeding ratio and you kept 50 grams of starter in your jar, you would have to feed it 50 grams of flour, 50 grams of water. But at that same ratio, 1-to-5-to-5, you do 10 grams of starter, and then you could do 50 grams of water to 50 grams of flour, and it will take longer for your starter to feed. Your starter actually will probably be at its strongest in a higher feeding ratio than a 1-to-1-to-1. But ultimately, there's so many factors that go into the balance. Your kitchen temperature, the temperature of the water, the type of flour you use. Although I'm telling you right now, if you walk away from anything from here, you need a flour with a decent gluten content, so at least 11.5%, so all purpose at the minimum. You can definitely use rye flour, whole wheat flour, add that to it. Your water has to be filtered or spring water, and the flour you use cannot be bleached. Bleach will kill your starter. So whatever flour type you're using, make sure it's unbleached flour. So now I'm going to go back to the concept I talked about at the beginning, the starter hydration level. And in your starter, that is looking at the amount of water to the amount of flour. So if the amount of water that you have is less than the amount of flour that you have less than 100% hydration in your starter. So to do the math, for example, if you have, and some people actually do feed more flour than water, they prefer a stiffer starter, and that works for them, and it might work for you. That's the beauty of this. You play around to see what works for you. I know for me, I don't always, although for the most part I do the 1-to-5-to-5 ratio, sometimes I'll switch it up a little and do a 1:2 feeding ratio. You're gonna really get to know your starter. You're gonna see different things happening with it. And these are tools that how you can adjust to make it stronger. But for you to know that you have a strong starter, before I get back to this, it has to consistently double every 12 hours after feeding. Now that might happen before 12 hours, and that's great, but it shouldn't take more than 12 hours. The caveat is, of course, if you're in the winter, it might take longer. But that's a sign of a healthy starter, that it doubles within 12 hours of a feeding. But for the most part, it's actually gonna more than double. It's gonna probably triple and be very bubbly. So that's another sign of a good starter. Another sign of a good starter is a smell. And I do encourage you, although at the beginning, it's gonna smell nasty to smell, because that's another one of your senses where it will let you know, is my starter okay? Ultimately, you're gonna find this citrusy, tangy, it's gonna smell pleasant. When you smell an alcohol smell, it's a sign that it's hungry. You may not visually be able to see it because it might not have hooch, but that's a sign that it's hungry. If it's smelling cheesy, for example, and your starter is mature, there may be something imbalance happening where you might want to adjust your feeding that way. Another thing to make sure your starter is good, you want to check it every time. If you see even a little bit of mold, and the mold could be a pinkish, a weird green color, and you might say, well, my starter is gray, and for rye flour that might be the case. You'll use your judgment. Fuzz. And if your starter has mold, that's it. Kill it, be done with it. You cannot revive a starter that has mold. It's not going to be healthy. Now, if you're a person who has been saving your discard, you actually have starter in your fridge. And I'm assuming it was discarded before the mold. Discard, again, it's just unfed starter. You're not maintaining it, but you can bake with it. So you don't have to start the process from the beginning if you are saving discard. Now, going back to the math. So if you have 40 grams of water to 50 grams of flour, you actually have 80% hydration. And the way we got to that is revisiting the math. 40 divided by 50, the amount of water to flour is equal to 0.8, which is equal to 80%. You have to look at your recipes. Most recipes call for 100% hydration, but some recipes call for a lower hydration recipe, some call for higher hydration. Now, going back, if your water is greater than the amount of flour, then you have a greater than 100% hydration level. So here's an example. In our starter, we have 50 grams of water and 40 grams of flour. You have 125% hydration starter. Water to flour, 50 divided by 40 is equal to 1.25, which is equal to 125%. Now we're going to cover some recipe percentages. When you're talking about recipe percentage, it's parts as it relates to the total amount of flour that you have. So I'm going to show you what's kind of a standard recipe when it comes to a loaf of bread. And this is also why I will say, if you get into sourdough, or even if you get into bread baking, not with sourdough, it's going to be very hard for you to go back to store-bought bread, because once you start baking, look at the ingredient list in a bag of store-bought bread. There are so many additives to it, you can taste the actual difference. In a plain sourdough loaf, all the ingredients you need is flour, salt, water. That's it. And starter is flour and water. So you have at most 4 ingredients that you're putting into it. 2 different types of flour, salt, and water. That's it. That's why you notice a difference. It is so simple. And believe it or not, sourdough actually lasts a good few days as well. You can always freeze it. So that's why I do warn you, I do not buy store-bought bread in my house anymore once I started baking. Now don't get me wrong, if I want an Italian loaf and I don't really want to bake that, I will go to a bakery and get that. But no more sandwich bread. So Wonder Bread, Pepperidge Farm, whatever bread company, I will not buy it anymore. Also, if you are picking up sourdough in a supermarket, make sure you take a look at the ingredients. If there's more than these ingredients, and it's okay if there's honey or maple syrup in it, I put that in mind sometimes, that's okay. But if you see a lot more additives, you actually are not eating true sourdough bread. So going back, this is kind of a basic beginning standard recipe for a plain loaf of sourdough bread. There's 500 grams total flour. It's usually a breakdown of bread flour and some type of whole grain flour. But in this case, in this example, I have whole wheat flour. You can use all-purpose flour instead of bread flour, but bread flour has a higher protein content, gluten protein content, and it's actually a little better at absorbing water. 10 grams of salt, 350 grams of water, and 100 grams of starter. So looking at this recipe and looking at some of the terms we looked at before, let's look at the hydration level in a recipe. So the hydration level, it goes back to, it's the amount of water to flour. So in our recipe, we were using 350 grams of water, 500 grams of flour. If you do 350 divided by 500, you get to 0.7, which is a 70% hydration dough. I will tell you at the beginning, when you're starting with sourdough, you might even want to go lower and do 60% hydration. Until you get used to your dough, it is hard to work. The higher the hydration, the higher it is. So that's just a caveat. I stick with the 70% hydration dough because as you see when we do bread baking, I'm also adding a little water along the way, so it boosts up the hydration. But for a beginner, you might want to start at a 65% hydration, even lower. So in this case, this is 70%, but if you wanted to bring it down to 60%, you should use 300 grams of water, because 300 divided by 500 is 0.6. But you'll, as I said, you'll get to know the process. Now the inoculation rate is, again in the recipe, the amount of starter to the amount of flour. So in our recipe, we use 100 grams of starter to 500 grams of flour, and that equals to 0.2, which is 20%. So that's the inoculation percentage. If you want to look at your flour content, we have 500 grams of flour in total. 450 divided by 500. 90% of your flour is bread flour. 50 divided by 500. 10% of your flour is whole wheat. You can use all bread flour. You don't even need to use whole wheat. But it's kind of nice to experiment with a little bit of different flours in there. Your salt content in your recipe, again, the amount of salt per flour. 10 grams of salt divided by 500 is 0.02, which is 2% salt. Some recipes call for a little less, some recipes call for a little more. You cannot skip out on the salt. You cannot. Salt is an essential part of the bread baking process. Now, just a few more terms I want to go through now. In some recipes, in some videos, you might hear a term, autolyse, I'm not sure. But basically, that's when in your recipe, you just put the flour and water, and you let it sit, usually for an hour, to let your flour absorb the water. I personally don't use the autolyse process. I know professional bakers, some of them do, some of them don't. But that is a process, and you'll get to experiment if you want. The more common process that most people do when it comes to sourdough, and I might have spelled it wrong, so it's a fermentalise. I'm not sure if it's a Y or an I there, but we're gonna go with it, fermentalise. And that is actually when you combine your leaven or your starter, your ferment, your leavening agent, when you add it to the water and flour, and then you just let it sit there for an hour to let everything incorporate. And that's the process we're gonna do, a fermentalise. Now, when you do the fermentalise, and this is a tricky part that took me a while to really understand. Once you combine your ferment, your leaven, your wild yeast with your flour and water, you have also begun the bulk fermentation process. The bulk fermentation process is the first rise. This is when your starter, your leaven, is going to really start eating through the flour and the water and the salt. Salt slows down the process a little, but and in some recipes they'll tell you to add the salt after, but it doesn't matter. Your bulk ferment starts at the beginning when you add your ferment into it. Now, if you decide I'd rather follow this recipe and do the autolyse first, and then you add your ferment, then the bulk fermentation process begins then. And with your bulk fermentation process, and this is going to be the trickiest part in sourdough baking. I will say it took me about 3 months for it to finally click with me. And even then, even the most experienced bakers struggle with the bulk fermentation process, because again, so many factors go into it. Your kitchen, your altitude. And that's why when it comes to sourdough baking, time is a guide. You have to get to know your dough, because if a recipe says bulk ferment for 6 hours, that's in their kitchen conditions. That's with their starter. That's with their flour. That's with their altitude. That's with their humidity. It's a guide. You're ultimately going to have to watch and study and learn your dough. And it is tricky and it is frustrating, because you want to get it right at the beginning. I had a problem where I was underproofing my sourdough for the longest time, and I knew something was off. It tasted great, don't get me wrong, but it was just way denser, and sourdough is a denser bread as is. And then I finally, maybe earlier this week actually, finally got it. I did get emotional over it, and it finally clicked in my head. I finally truly understood my dough. So I will tell you, the bulk fermentation process, and we'll go through it, is going to be the hardest step in the process to learn. And even if you've mastered it, it's still going to be tricky, because so many factors. Your bulk fermentation will go faster in the summer than it does in the winter. In the summer, it could go as little as 3.5 hours. In the winter, it could go as much as 18 hours. We'll talk more about bulk fermentation, but that's the first rise. That's when you mix everything, you do your stretching exercises, and you're getting the first rise. And it's not necessarily doubling in size. You might need a rise that's only 10% or 20%. There's going to be different conditions that go into it. So that's one of the hardest parts. And then the last term I just want to talk about quickly is your second proof. After your bulk fermentation phase, you're going to shape your dough. And when we do the recipe, you'll see what that is. And there's different ways after you shape your dough. Most recipes will call for a cold proof in the fridge for at least 8 hours. I personally cold proof my dough. Some people just leave it for 2 hours on the counter. That's okay too. But that's the second rise, that's the second proof. So those are just some of the terms and math as it comes to sourdough. That's it for this video, and I hope you found it helpful. Have a good one, everyone.